Well, let's move on. Dying of money. Parsons points out just how bad things became. In 1922, in Weimar, before the inflation, a German mark was worth around $1 U.S. Now, the mark was written off by the end of this, within about 2 or 3 years, to 1 trillion marks to one. Now, I couldn't believe this when I read it, but that's a whole warehouse filled to the ceiling, able to purchase not a single American dollar. And here's the interesting thing. 190 billion marks were outstanding. If you added everyone up or you put them all together, it wasn't enough to purchase a single newspaper.
Absolutely amazing. And the other things that Parsons get into is the impact on society and day-to-day life, which can really be quite devastating because interacting in the marketplace, to fulfill our needs or wants with the money that we use for our transactions, that's the key to the way we live, particularly now because of the reliance on others in our very complex society compared to Weimar Germany, which was still quite agrarian.
Another aspect of the story that I'd really like to hear your thoughts on, the similarities between the collapse in Weimar and what we're seeing today. A lot of people, when they think of this sort of inflationary, hyperinflationary disaster, they think it comes on suddenly, it's over, and then everybody starts picking back up the pieces. But Parsons points out there really was an 8 or 9 year buildup period, that it wasn't until 1914 that they abandoned the gold standard. It took about a decade before the currency actually imploded. And, I can't help but see the similarities there to our U.S. dollar. We've taken off the gold standard by Nixon early 70s. Since then, the petrodollar arrangement seems to have held everything in check for a couple of decades.
There's another interesting similarity going back to Weimar Germany. In that 10-year span, there were moments in time when they actually felt like they had deflation. In the early 1920s, after the boom in 1921, they were actually concerned about deflation, and that's one of the reasons why they got the printing presses going, which is exactly what's happening here in the United States. The Federal Reserve is concerned about deflation. Bernanke's been talking about that for years. We've seen how they've built up the Federal Reserve's balance sheet to fight inflation. That's exactly what Rudolf Havenstein, who was the head of the Reichsbank in Weimar Germany, was thinking. He had to prevent deflation. And once he got on the treadmill, he was afraid to get off. Just like Mr. Bernanke is now in that treadmill and he's afraid to get off. I expect that you're going to see quantitative easing again in the United States in the not-too-distant future. Whether it comes before the election or not, I don't know. But that quantitative easing is clearly going to put the U.S. on the hyperinflationary road.
They did, as you pointed out, try to remedy the situation by printing. They printed up bonds to pay off the debt. But, the tax base, it was no longer able to cover the expenses, the war expenses and reparations. And that is what's occurring right here domestically. We're already taxed up to our eyeballs. Nearly every state, from what I'm seeing in the papers here, is bankrupt or close to it. Many cities, towns, municipalities. Who will be the lender of last resort when even our federal government is bankrupt? The printing press.
But, the important point is that the public sector is eating away at the private sector. I mentioned before that 58% of the population are reliant upon a government check to some extent. What government at all levels has to realize is that they have to tighten their belt. They can't just continue spending and taxing because eventually you're just going to kill the private sector. And I think we're pretty close to that point. We've already reached a stage where there's just so much government debt being put on, it has to go to the Federal Reserve and turn it into currency. We see China increasingly reluctant to grow its exposure to U.S. government debt. We saw the Chinese rating agency downgrade U.S. government debt because of their concerns about whether the U.S. government can maintain all of its promises that it's made. It's quite clear that it can't. But people just, when you're in the middle of a bubble, and we are in a bubble that has this blind faith on government promises, without people questioning whether those promises are ever going to be realized, you sort of accept the conventional wisdom and not question it. But we've reached a stage where those promises have to be broken. If they're not, the currency is going to be broken one way or the other. There's some serious trouble coming.
You know, I think that's an interesting point, and I think it ties in with the fact right around 1920, Weimar actually suddenly became the envy of the world. They had an economic miracle. They were the only country that continued to print during a global recession, and many of these newspaper articles, according to Parsons, were pointing out that, as I said, they were the envy of the world. Even the victors of World War I were envious of their economic miracle. 2 years later, the whole house of cards imploded. And my point simply is, people think we're in a recovery. What if it's a mirage?
Yeah, and the other thing you have to keep in mind about Germany, it wasn't some backwater. Germany was one of the wealthiest, highest, most well-read countries in the world. It had a very, very first-class living standard. It had one of the highest living standards in the world. It wasn't a backwater. And to be devastated by the hyperinflation is quite astounding. If it can happen in Germany, it can happen anywhere, is the bottom line.
Exactly. And, he also points out that, money was so easy to be had, there was not really any reason to work too hard for it. Why save? The youth became carefree, crime rates soared, and, although almost everyone had work was easy to find, the wages didn't keep up with the cost of living. The quality of work deteriorated. Gambling became rampant. To me, in many ways, this looks like the front page of almost any major newspaper in the U.S.
Yeah, the only difference is that in Germany, they didn't have all of the opportunities for consumers to borrow as we have here in the United States, which ultimately means the problem in the United States is going to be much worse than it was in Weimar Germany, because of the personal debt loads that you're seeing at the consumer level.
They just didn't have those plastic debt cards in their wallets, I guess.
Absolutely right.
The home ATM machines. Another subtle but I think significant aspect of his work is he talks about how almost everyone had a job. Some of these jobs were redundant. And you alluded to the fact that almost 50%, half of Americans, count on the government for some type of assistance. Not all of that is work, of course, but tens of millions do. And I think there's an interesting tie-in here. When their crash came, those jobs evaporated almost overnight. Could we see something similar with some of our governmental jobs?
Yeah, I think we have to, because governments have to tighten their belts. They're spending too much money. They're spending too much money relative to the size of the amount of wealth being created in the private sector. So there has to be belt tightening. There has to be government job destroyed. We're seeing that to some extent. We've been reading, municipalities and even states to some extent are cutting jobs, or California trying to pay people the minimum wage instead of cutting a job, reducing salaries to the minimum wage. But something has to give. What's likely to happen is that government has to shrink.
And as we wrap up, Parsons puts emphasis on this, that speculation became rife, one of the nation's largest activities. And James, this is a page, once again, torn right out of fiat money inflation in France, which occurred about 150 years before the Weimar episode. Hauntingly familiar echoes of inflation throughout recorded history.
Yeah, absolutely. Andrew Dixon White's Fiat Inflation in France is another good book that everyone should read.
And we're going to have free copies for everyone. I wanted to mention we found it, as I said, $34 on eBay, unlimited number of copies. And I also have a free link here for listeners. Anyone who makes a kind donation into our tip jar will be at the top of the list, and we'll send you a free link to a copy of this ebook. All right, James, for folks who'd like to find out more about gold money, as well as your book,
it was updated in a paperback edition, and given what had happened to the dollar against gold, they changed the name from the coming collapse of the dollar to the collapse of the dollar. It's still available on Amazon. It's still selling quite well. And you can find out about gold money, goldmoney.com.
And I understand that you recently topped the 1 billion level.
There was 1 billion of customer assets that we're now safeguarding in gold money, with vaults that we're using in London, Zurich, and Hong Kong, which has been added recently. Hong Kong's becoming quite popular, by the way, Chris. We already have 2.5% of all of the customer assets in gold money being stored in Hong Kong. It's basically geographic diversification. The biggest risk today to your gold is government. And by diversifying geographically in different countries, different political systems, that's a way to mitigate your risk. You don't want to take risks with gold or silver because they're the bedrock asset in your portfolio. So diversifying it geographically is one way to mitigate that risk.
Well, sir, we want to thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule today. Wish you a safe and profitable week ahead.
Thanks, Chris. It's always a pleasure to speak with you.